There are machines that do a job, and then there are machines that become something else entirely, something that outlives every expectation, every limitation, every role anyone ever imagined for them. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is that second kind of machine. It began as a simple idea. Build a fighter that is light, make it fast, make it cheap enough to actually fly in numbers, and above all make it win in a turning fight. Nobody was asking for a legend. Nobody sat in a boardroom in the early 1970s and said, let's build an aircraft that will still be relevant 60 years from now. They just wanted something that could beat a MiG without bankrupting the Air Force. What they got was something far more difficult to explain. What they got was the Viper. The year is 1974. Edwards Air Force Base, California. A sleek, unusual little jet sits on the runway, the YF-16 General Dynamics entry into the Air Force's lightweight fighter competition. The aircraft is radical by the standards of the day. A single engine, a frameless bubble canopy giving the pilot an almost unobstructed view. A fly-by-wire flight control system, meaning no direct mechanical link between the pilot's hands and the control surfaces, just computers interpreting intent and translating it into motion. And a reclined seat tilted back at 30 degrees, helping the pilot withstand the crushing G-forces of a hard-turning fight. On this particular day, nobody is planning to fly. The scheduled event is a high-speed taxi test. The idea is simple: roll down the runway, build up speed, see how the aircraft behaves on the ground. The pilot, Phil Eastricher, has done this kind of thing many times. It is routine, it is controlled, it is, by definition, not a flight. At 120 knots, something goes wrong. The nose comes up, not gently, sharply, unexpectedly, further than it should. The tail scrapes the runway, a wing tip catches, and now the aircraft is drifting off the centerline, eating up runway at a terrifying rate, desert scrub rushing closer by the second. Phil Eastricher has perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision. Stay on the ground and almost certainly destroy the aircraft in the dirt, or pull back and fly. He pulls back. The YF-16 lifts off, climbs, wobbles slightly as Eastricher brings it under control, and after 6 minutes in the air, an unplanned, unscheduled, completely accidental first flight, he brings it back down and lands it safely. The engineers are stunned. The Air Force is quietly thrilled, because what that accidental moment revealed was something you cannot design on paper, a jet so instinctively willing to fly that it almost flew itself. The YF-16 went on to beat its competitor in the lightweight fighter competition. And from that one improbable, unplanned liftoff, an entire lineage was born. The early days of the F-16 program were not without their scares. The engine had a troublesome habit of dropping to idle without warning, uncommanded, mid-flight, as if the jet itself had simply decided it had done enough work for the moment. This led to 2 dead-stick landings, meaning the aircraft came down with no engine power at all, relying entirely on its glide ratio and the pilot's skill to make it back to the runway alive. For a period, every test flight was planned to remain within gliding distance of the airfield. If the engine quit, you needed to be able to reach pavement. Then came the landing gear incident. During a demonstration flight, a hygiene maneuver, a specific control input designed to check the aircraft's responses, jammed the right main landing gear in a partially retracted position. Landing on the runway was out of the question. Test pilot Neil Anderson assessed his options and chose the grass alongside the runway, a controlled wheels-up landing that minimized the risk of the aircraft tumbling or catching fire. He brought it in clean. The aircraft was damaged but intact. Within a month, it was flying again. These were not failures, they were tuition payments. Every near disaster taught the engineers something they could not have learned any other way, and with each lesson absorbed, the F-16 grew stronger, more reliable, more refined. The Air Force was watching all of it closely, and what they saw beneath the early stumbles was a platform with extraordinary potential, not just as a fighter, as a foundation. In late 1975, one of the YF-16 prototypes was converted into something that had no real precedent, a control-configured vehicle, or CCV. The idea, at its core, was about breaking the fundamental rules of how aircraft move. Normally, when a fighter turns, it banks. When it pitches up, it begins to climb. The aircraft's attitude and its direction of travel are linked, changing one changes the other. That is simply how aircraft work. The CCV was built to challenge that assumption. By modifying the fly-by-wire system and adding new control surfaces, including a pair of distinctive pivoting ventral fins mounted vertically beneath the air intake, engineers gave the aircraft the ability to move its nose without changing its flight path, to translate sideways without banking, to point in one direction while still traveling in another. In a dogfight, the implications were enormous. A pilot who could point his nose independently of his direction of travel could do things in a fight that an adversary would have no framework to anticipate. The CCV flew for the first time in March 1976. Over the following year, it proved the concept. Not perfectly, there were limits and challenges, but convincingly enough to point toward something bigger. That something bigger arrived in 1980, under the name AFTI, the Advanced Fighter Technology Integration Program, a collaboration between the Air Force and NASA. Building on everything the CCV had demonstrated, engineers took a production F-16 and transformed it from the inside out. A fully digital flight control system, an automated maneuvering system capable of handling complex motion across all axes simultaneously, voice controls in the cockpit. And most remarkably, a helmet-mounted sight that linked the aircraft's radar and infrared sensors directly to wherever the pilot happened to be looking. Turn your head, the sensors follow. The AFTI F-16 took to the air in July 1982, and what followed was years of systematic methodical exploration. Phase by phase, the engineers pushed deeper. New sensors, better integration, cockpit layouts tested and retested for how they affected pilot workload, the aircraft learning, in a sense, to work with the human being inside it rather than simply being operated by one. And then the mission started to shift. Close air support. The brutal, dangerous, low-altitude work of finding and destroying targets on the ground while operating within range of everything the enemy could throw at you. It was a mission the F-16 had not been designed for, a mission that belonged, at the time, to a very different kind of aircraft. The A-10 Warthog is, by almost any aesthetic measure, an ugly airplane. It is thick, ungainly, and built around the most enormous rotary cannon ever fitted to a tactical aircraft. It was designed from the beginning to fly low and slow over the battlefield, absorb extraordinary amounts of damage, and keep killing tanks until there were no tanks left to kill. It is extraordinarily good at what it does. In the early 1980s, there was a serious push to have the F-16 take over some of that role. The thinking was logical enough: a jet that could do both air-to-air combat and close air support would be more flexible, more cost-effective, and easier to maintain in the field than two separate specialized aircraft. The AFTI F-16 was upgraded with the F-16 Sea Wing, fitted with the APG-68 radar and an interface for the LANTIRN targeting pod, and pushed into close air support testing. It was impressive. Target data passed directly from ground controllers or other aircraft, laser designation, off-axis weapons, digital systems connecting the whole picture. But the honest conclusion was more nuanced. The F-16 could do the job. In the strike role, precision weapons, fast in and fast out, high survivability through speed, it excelled. Where it struggled was in the sustained, low-slow, gun-focused work that the A-10 owned. The speed that made the Viper so survivable also made it harder to stay over a target, harder to line up a gun run, harder to loiter and wait for the right moment. One unit pushed that edge harder than anyone. The 174th Tactical Fighter Wing of the New York Air National Guard, transitioning from A-10s to F-16s, became the only operational unit to fly the Viper in a dedicated close air support role. They called it the FA-16. They mounted a 30mm gun pod under the fuselage to replicate the A-10's firepower in a faster jet. In 1991, they took it to war. The results were instructive. The gun was difficult to aim accurately at the speeds the F-16 naturally wanted to fly. The recoil from the gun was violent and disruptive. The experiment, born from genuine operational need and real ingenuity, simply ran into the physics of what the aircraft was. The pods came off, the A-10 kept its role. And the F-16 moved on to find the roles it was genuinely brilliant at. While the AFTI program was exploring the limits of what the Viper could do in flight, another program was examining what powered it. Both the F-16 and the Navy's F-14 Tomcat were flying behind Pratt & Whitney engines, powerful, proven, but not without their operational problems. The Air Force and Navy went looking for an alternative. General Electric had something interesting: the F-101, originally developed for the B-1 bomber. Large, high-thrust, and designed for an aircraft very different from a tactical fighter. The question was whether it could be made to think like one. Under what became known as the Derivative Fighter Engine Program, engineers took the F-101 and rebuilt it for the demands of a fighter. Throttle response refined for the rapid, aggressive power changes a pilot makes in combat. Fuel systems adjusted. The entire engine tuned for an environment of constant maneuvering rather than the long, steady cruise of a strategic bomber. The result was the F-101X in December 1980, the first F-16 fitted with this engine, designated simply the F-16-101, took to the air. The numbers were hard to argue with: more thrust, better performance, a different character to the jet that pilots could feel immediately. What those flights proved fed directly into the development of the F-110 engine, which became the second powerplant option for the F-16 and changed the aircraft's trajectory permanently. Competition in powerplants meant leverage for the Air Force. It meant better prices, more options, and ultimately better jets. The engine experiment that began with a bomber motor ended up making every F-16 that followed more capable. By the late 1970s, American foreign policy created a problem. New restrictions meant that the United States could not export its frontline fighters to allied nations. The technology was too sensitive, the capability too great. But allies still needed fighters. The world was not getting any safer. The Pentagon's answer was the FX concept, an export fighter, something better than what most nations were flying but deliberately limited compared to frontline American capability. Lower cost, simpler to maintain, politically acceptable. General Dynamics took the F-16 airframe and built the F-16-79. The engine was replaced with the J-79, an older proven turbojet that had already powered the F-104 Starfighter and the F-4 Phantom and was familiar to air forces around the world. The intake was reshaped. The fuselage stretched aft to accommodate the longer engine. Additional cooling and shielding managed the higher heat signature. The result was a Viper that was slightly heavier and slightly less powerful, but cheaper, simpler, and easier to support in nations that didn't have America's logistical infrastructure. It first flew in October 1980 and quickly demonstrated Mach 2 capability, full 9G performance, and genuinely impressive handling. It was not alone in the competition. Northrop had built something specifically for this moment, the F-20 Tiger Shark. Not a modified existing design but a purpose-built export fighter, lighter and simpler than even the F-16-79, with a quick-start capability that let it launch faster than almost anything else in the world. Northrop leaned into everything that mattered to smaller air forces: reliability, ease of maintenance, fast turnaround, affordable operation. For a period, the outcome was genuinely uncertain: two different philosophies, two different answers to what the world needed. In the end, the F-16-79 prevailed in evaluations. But the export fighter story had a postscript that nobody had anticipated. The F-16 was evaluated in Navy colors, tested against the possibility of carrier operations. The Navy passed. The landing gear wasn't built for carrier impact loads. The narrow track was unforgiving on a pitching deck. Most significantly, the single engine, already a subject of debate in the Air Force, was a far more serious concern over water. Every proposed modification to fix these issues added weight and complexity that eroded what made the F-16 special in the first place. The Navy chose a twin-engine design built from the ground up for carrier life. The Viper moved on, it always did. Of all the F-16's variants, none looked more dramatically different than the one that began with a question about shape. General Dynamics had history with Delta wings. The F-102 Delta Dagger, the B-58 Hustler. They understood what a large, sweeping Delta could do at high speed: the efficiency, the reduced drag, the ability to carry fuel and weapons within the wing itself rather than hanging them outside in the airflow. In the early 1980s, they applied that knowledge to the F-16 in the most ambitious way possible. They called it the F-16XL. The wing was completely different, a crank-tail Delta design, wide and sweeping, more than twice the area of the original F-16 wing. The fuselage was stretched to balance it. The result barely looked like a Viper at first glance, it looked like a different species. But the numbers were extraordinary. Internal fuel capacity nearly doubled on some mission profiles. Range extended dramatically. Weapons could be carried semi-recessed within the wing, reducing drag compared to external pylons. The aircraft could cruise supersonically without afterburner, a capability that changed the calculus of strike missions entirely. The Air Force was running a competition, the Enhanced Tactical Fighter Program, looking for a new deep strike aircraft. Long range, heavy payload, able to penetrate defended airspace, destroy targets, and get home. General Dynamics entered the XL, the F-16 had grown up. On the other side of the competition stood the F-15E, McDonnell Douglas's transformation of the already formidable F-15 into a dedicated strike platform. Bigger, more powerful, carrying more payload over greater distances behind two massive engines. In testing, the XL delivered on its promises. Range, payload, performance, it was a genuine competitor. It wasn't enough. The F-15's size and power won out. The Strike Eagle was selected. The XL, despite everything it had demonstrated, was left behind. But the story had one more chapter. In 1988, both XL prototypes were transferred to NASA, where they became test beds for supersonic laminar flow research, the science of keeping airflow smooth and attached over a wing surface at high speed, reducing drag in ways that could benefit not just fighters, but a future generation of commercial supersonic transport. The XL spent years collecting data that would shape aircraft not yet imagined. A fighter that never entered service, a wing that helped build the future anyway. The Navy had turned down the F-16 for its carrier fleet, but it wanted the Viper for something else entirely. At the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, the business of training naval aviators to survive in combat, had always depended on having a credible adversary aircraft. For years, that role belonged to the A-4 Skyhawk, a small and agile jet that could simulate older Soviet fighters reasonably well. Against a MiG-17, the A-4 was a useful stand-in. But Soviet aviation had not stood still. By the late 1980s, the MiG-29 and the Su-27 had entered service, aircraft in a completely different performance category from anything the A-4 could simulate. Top Gun needed an adversary that could actually keep up. They turned to the F-16N, a stripped-down, lightened Viper built for one purpose: not to win wars, to teach people how to fight them. The F-16N that arrived at Top Gun was a different kind of weapon. With unnecessary systems removed and weight reduced wherever possible, it was optimized purely for air combat performance. And its versatility was unlike anything the adversary training community had seen before. Need to simulate a MiG-17? Fly it one way. A MiG-21? Adjust the parameters. A MiG-29 or Su-27, the F-16N could represent those threats in a way the A-4 never could. For a generation of naval aviators, the F-16N was the jet that kept them honest. It was fast enough to stay with anything they flew against it. It was agile enough to punish mistakes. It forced pilots to adapt, to anticipate rather than react, to think ahead in the fight rather than just respond to what was already happening. The F-16N wasn't there to win, it was there to teach, and it taught hard. The Viper's adaptability extended beyond combat. For decades, tactical reconnaissance, the job of flying into contested airspace to photograph and scan what the enemy was doing, had belonged to the RF-4 Phantom. Fast, reliable, and built for the mission from the ground up. By the 1980s, the RF-4 was aging, and the sensors that once required a dedicated aircraft had grown small enough to carry in a pod. The F-16 adapted. External reconnaissance pods mounted beneath the fuselage carried electro-optical cameras for daylight operations and infrared sensors for night and low visibility. Systems like ATARS, the Advanced Tactical Airborne Reconnaissance System, brought high-resolution digital imagery to the mission, along with something the old film-based systems could never offer: near real-time data transmission. The images didn't have to wait for the aircraft to land and the film to be developed. They could be processed, transmitted, and used while the mission was still in progress. In Desert Storm, F-16s monitored targets across Iraq and Kuwait. In the Balkans, they tracked troop movements and air defense systems. Over Afghanistan, they provided real-time intelligence as the battlefield evolved beneath them. One aircraft, one pod, eyes wherever they were needed. Range had always been the F-16's compromise. A lightweight fighter carries less fuel. Less fuel means shorter legs. For the missions, the Viper was originally designed for air defense, close air combat that was acceptable. For a world increasingly asking it to strike targets hundreds of miles away, it was a problem. The Air Force solved it in stages. External fuel tanks came first, 370-gallon tanks under the wings, 300-gallon tanks on the centerline. Combat radius extended past 300, sometimes 400 miles depending on the mission profile. The penalty was drag and performance degradation. External tanks made the jet heavier and slower. Conformal fuel tanks offered a better answer. Fitted along the upper fuselage and blended carefully into the aircraft's lines, they carried roughly 450 additional gallons without occupying weapon stations and with far less aerodynamic penalty than traditional tanks. The F-16 began to transform from a short-range fighter into a genuine long-range strike platform. Export operators pushed it further. Israel's F-16 Isufa built for the specific demands of operating across the Middle East. The UAE's Block 60 Desert Falcon with both extended range and avionics that in some respects surpassed what the US Air Force was flying. These were not just fighters anymore. They were long-range strike systems capable of going deep, hitting hard, and returning home. And for those who needed to go even further, the answer was aerial refueling. Most Air Force F-16s were designed around the boom refueling system, connecting to large tankers in midair. But many export operators used probe and drogue systems instead. The Viper adapted a fixed refueling probe along the forward fuselage, compatible with a wider range of tankers, letting the aircraft connect to the hose and extend its range almost indefinitely. The Indian Air Force equipped their Vipers with probes from the start, designed to work seamlessly with their existing tanker fleet. Same jet, longer reach every time. And then came the experiment that seemed to push beyond what any conventional aircraft should be able to do. The NF-16D, known as Vista for Variable Stability In-Flight Simulator Test Aircraft, was one of the most unusual machines ever to wear F-16 markings. At first glance, it looked like any other Viper, but it could do something no other aircraft in history had been able to do quite the same way. It could become a different airplane on command. Vista could simulate other aircraft in flight, adjusting its handling characteristics in real time. A test pilot could climb in and experience, with remarkable fidelity, what it felt like to fly a design that didn't yet exist. Control laws for future aircraft could be tested without building those aircraft first. The human factors of cockpits not yet manufactured could be evaluated, refined, and improved, all inside the familiar shell of an F-16. Then came MATV, multi-axis thrust vectoring. The concept was straightforward in principle and almost incomprehensible in practice. Instead of relying solely on aerodynamic surfaces to control the aircraft, a modified exhaust nozzle could physically direct the engine's thrust, pointing it up, down, or sideways to push the nose wherever the pilot needed it to go, even in conditions where the aerodynamic surfaces had lost effectiveness entirely. What this meant in practice was that the aircraft could perform maneuvers that should not be possible. At extremely high angles of attack, the angle between the aircraft's nose and its direction of travel, conventional fighters run out of control authority. The airflow separates from the wings and control surfaces. The aircraft stops responding normally. In a combat situation, this is where you die. The Vista MATV could operate in that envelope with the engine itself providing control. Angles of attack beyond 128 degrees were demonstrated. The nose went places that aerodynamics said it couldn't go. Test pilots watching from the ground described it as looking wrong, as though the laws that governed how aircraft moved had been temporarily suspended. The MATV never entered production. The complexity and cost were too great for frontline service, but the program did exactly what it was designed to do. It mapped the edges of what was possible. It proved concepts. It generated data that shaped the thinking behind the next generation of fighters. The Viper once again was out ahead of everyone else. There is something almost philosophical about what the F-16 story represents. It began as a response to a specific problem at a specific moment: the lessons of Vietnam, the cost of complexity, the need for a fighter that could outmaneuver everything the Soviets were fielding in a turning fight. The people who built it were solving a problem, not building a legacy. And yet, from that one starting point, that single accidental first flight above the California desert in 1974, an entire family of aircraft grew. Some variants made it to the front lines and flew in every major conflict of the following decades. Others lived and died in the world of testing, never seeing operational service but contributing ideas and technologies that shaped everything that came after. The CCV showed that control itself could be a weapon. The AFTI demonstrated that pilot and machine could work together in ways no one had imagined. The XL proved that a completely different wing could unlock performance the original design never contemplated. The Vista MATV pushed the boundary of what flight control even meant. Across more than 25 nations, across 60 years and counting, across roles that nobody foresaw when the contract was signed: reconnaissance, adversary training, export, close air support, long-range strike, aerodynamic research. The F-16 is not a single aircraft, it never really was. It is a question asked repeatedly across decades by engineers and pilots and program managers who kept refusing to believe they had found the limits. The question was always the same: what else can this thing do? The answer apparently is still being written. The Viper didn't just spread across the world's air forces. It evolved block by block, variant by variant, into something bigger than any single airplane. A family, a lineage, and one unmistakable attitude. This is the story of the F-16 Fighting Falcon and the people who refused to let it stay ordinary.